It's come to my attention that not everybody appreciates my opening theme music. As one viewer writes, "Good God, man, Freud is jarring enough. The least you can do is give us some soothing music." Well, ask and you shall receive. Nah, I'm just joking. It's not that bad. All right, let's get on with the show and talk some Freud. Freud focuses a lot on day residue. He writes that in every dream it is possible to find a point of contact with experiences of the previous day. And for this reason, he will often begin his dream interpretations by looking for the event of the previous day that set the dream in motion. He shares one of his own dreams to provide an example of this. The dream is short and simple. In it, Freud has written a monograph on a plant, and he is looking down at the monograph. That's pretty much the dream. So Freud has the dream, then he sits down and he does what you do when you have a dream, and he starts associating. So he starts with the image of the plant monograph. This reminds him of the previous morning. He'd been in a bookshop and there stumbled across a book on cyclamens. Cyclamens were his wife's favorite flower, so then he was reminded of his wife and how he needs to be better at buying his wife flowers. And this led to the thought of Frau L. And Frau L is someone he knew, and Frau L had recently been very upset with her husband because it was her birthday and he forgot to buy her flowers. Now, Freud feels that these associations are interesting, but he senses that there's more there. He's missing something. So he returns to the dream. Now, remember, the dream is short and simple. Freud has written a monograph on a plant, and he's looking down at the monograph. So he thinks again about the monograph in the dream, and then he resumes associating. This time, he thinks of a monograph he wrote about plants several years ago. He wrote a monograph about the coca plant. And he then thinks of Carl Koller. And based on some things Freud had written in that monograph, Koller discovered that cocaine has anesthetic properties. This led to a daydream that Freud had had the previous day, and Freud had imagined that he would need to go in for glaucoma surgery. He imagined that he would go far away to Berlin for the surgery. He imagined himself in the operating room talking to the surgeon, and the surgeon would be ignorant of Freud's importance. The surgeon wouldn't know that because of Freud's monograph, Carl Koller was able to discover the anesthetic properties of cocaine, and now the anesthetic the surgeon was using was in part because of Freud's genius. This led to a memory of Freud's father, and Freud's father had once gone to the hospital for glaucoma surgery. And after the surgery, Freud had talked to the surgeon, Dr. Konigstein, who was well aware of Freud's importance. This led to a memory of the previous day. Freud had stumbled across another book, this book celebrating Carl Koller, but failing to recognize Freud's own contributions. This led to a memory of a party Freud attended the previous evening. And at that party, Freud had had a conversation with none other than Dr. Konigstein, and also, interestingly, a man named Dr. Gardner. Here's a plant reference, and that seems significant. Freud thinks about his conversation with Dr. Konigstein, and they talked about Frau L., another plant reference. They also had a conversation about one of Freud's patients, a woman named Flora, yet another plant reference. Freud now thinks about Dr. Gardner, and he remembers that Dr. Gardner had been one of the co-authors of the book about Carl Koller that had overlooked Freud. And Freud also remembers that Freud had made a comment to Dr. Gardner and his wife, saying that they both looked blooming. Yet another plant reference. Okay, one more time, let's go back and follow the chain of associations here. Freud thinks about the plant monograph, leads to a thought of his own monograph, leads to thoughts of Carl Koller, leads to a daydream about glaucoma and going to Berlin, leads to a daydream about the surgeon there being ignorant of Freud's importance. This leads to a memory of Freud's father having glaucoma surgery. This leads to a memory of Dr. Königstein, the one who operated on Freud's father, who knew that Freud had influenced Karl Kohler. This leads to a memory of a book Freud had seen the other day, celebrating Karl Kohler and overlooking Freud. This leads to a memory of a party that Freud went to the previous night, leading to memories of conversations he had with Dr. Königstein and Dr. Gardner, leading to memories of a conversation with Dr. Königstein about Frau L, and a conversation with Dr. Königstein about Flora. And thinking about Dr. Gardner reminds him that Dr. Gardner had been a co-author of the book that had overlooked Freud. And then Freud also remembers a comment he made about Dr. Gardner and his wife that they looked blooming. Freud noticed that all of these associations were pointing in the same directions. They were communicating a specific message, that message being that Freud had been overlooked for the part he had played in the discovery that cocaine has anesthetic properties. And the wish in this dream is very obvious. Freud wants recognition. Now, had Freud not attended the party that evening, his unconscious mind would not have constructed this particular dream. For if he had not attended the party, then this particular dream would have just led to some associations about flowers. It would not have communicated the message it wanted to get across. Because it was only when Freud focused on the party and began making associations from things that had happened at the party that the dream's message could be understood. Now, of course, it would have been easier for his unconscious mind to be more direct and to construct a dream that was explicitly about the party. But this might have been too obvious, and it might not have eluded his internal censor. And so to elude the censor, this dream-producing part of his unconscious engaged in trickery. So this part of his unconscious drew an obvious link between the dream and the book on cyclamens that he had seen the previous morning. This would have seemed safe enough to the censor part of his unconscious, but all the while, the dream-producing part of his unconscious knew that there were subtle links between the book on cyclamens and the party. The book on cyclamens and the talk about Frau L, link number 1. The book on cyclamens and the talk about Flora, link number 2. The book on cyclamens and Dr. Gardner, link number 3. The book on cyclamens and the comment about blooming, link number 4. And so this part knew that once Freud began to make associations about the book on cyclamens, he would eventually find these links, and his attention would turn to the party, thus enabling him to understand the dream's true message. Now, there's 2 more things I want to point out. First of all, just as Freud promised, this dream illustrates the importance of day residue. So in this dream, we have a bunch of events from the previous day that in and of themselves don't seem that significant, but they're put together in such a way as to communicate a profoundly important message. Second, it's worth noting how vulnerable Freud makes himself. In this dream, just like Irma's injection, Freud is letting the world know that he is obsessed with his own reputation. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, most of us are obsessed with our reputation, and that's true, but Freud is putting it out there. He's admitting it. Most of us would not have the chutzpah to do that. And so now, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together as I present the winner of this year's Brazen Honesty Award to none other than Sigmund Freud.